Mind Your Farm Business on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by RBC Royal Bank.
In 2015, Canada's agricultural exports surpassed $55 billion in value, making Canada the fifth largest ag exporting country in the world. The situation when it comes to international trade is, of course, always changing. We hear the headlines and news reports about trade deals being negotiated, finalized, ratified, and so on. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Canada-EU deal, the two that come to mind lately. We've also seen bilateral arrangements with South Korea, potentially Japan, maybe China down the road. We hear how this is good for canola exports or beef sales, IP soybean demand, equipment import prices, so on. Not good for dairy. We hear about the high-level impact in these news reports. But what do these deals actually mean at the individual farm or business level? What kind of impact do they have there? Good, bad? Do they offer risks, opportunities? I'm Kelvin Hepner, and welcome to another episode of the Mind Your Farm Business podcast. Together with RBC, we are discussing ways to improve your farm management, focusing on farm management as part of this series. And today we're talking about taking advantage of trade deals with David McInnes. David is the president and CEO of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute and the author of several reports looking at trade-related opportunities for Canadian businesses. Of course, most Canadian farms not directly in contact with an export market, so while we know we're reliant on trade, it's not necessarily top of mind. And so I think there's some element of why should I care thinking when it comes to talking about trade deals. Well, hopefully we answer that question, why you should care and how TPP, CETA, how these international trade deals can and will impact your business. So David, we have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Canada-EU deal. We recently saw the bilateral deal with Korea. From a farm or individual ag business perspective, how can we turn these deals into opportunities at that level?
Well, we're a trading country, and our agri-food sector depends on external markets for obvious reasons. It's important to our growth. So the trade agreements that we've been signing and hopefully are negotiating down the road are vital for a country like Canada. But the key issue is once those deals are signed, actually the hard work begins, and that is how do you get actual product to the customer or on the consumer shelf in whatever the country is. And that's often where the headlines celebrate the trade access agreement, but the hard work comes following through on that.
Mm-hmm. That's where you run into all the complications, whether it's non-tariff trade barriers and some of the stuff in more the weeds.
Well, certainly there are non-tariff trade barriers. There are a variety of standards that every country has, including our country here, Canada, when others want to export to Canada or we import into our country. So standards are normal. They're not deemed to be necessarily trade barriers, but they are costs of doing business and requirements of doing business. Then there are the supply chains themselves that have those sorts of arrangements, such as a retailer or even a processor, to meet certain quality attributes, such as sustainability requirements. These are all part and parcel of the country access audit that one has to make, whether you're a finished product, a food product, or an ingredient supplier. These are all the things that have to be dealt with.
Okay. You used the word audit. On this podcast, we've spent a lot of time talking about risk management for businesses, assessing and prioritizing risks, and of course with risks also come opportunities. Is there a role or a place for businesses to also do this when it comes to trade and international markets, to actually take an analytical approach to risks and opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think really the key here is to there's different ways to phrase it, but what's your scan that you're going to do or conduct to get product, as I said, on that shelf? and that might be to at the very basic, how do we get it out of our country? What method of shipment? Do we go through via another country, such as a U.S. port, if it's a bulk product? And then what are the regulatory steps, the customs steps to get it into a market? There's the marketplace assessment. What retailer are you going to target, or what region are you going to target? And then, of course, at the end of the day, and as we move down the chain, this becomes even more important, is what's your consumer demographic? And who's going to want to buy your particular product? So those are all the pieces that need to come together.
Sounds complicated with a lot of moving parts.
Well, it's a lot of moving parts, but that's our companies here and the commodity sectors are pretty well oiled to respond to the markets and those opportunities. That the challenge is that the consumer or the customer, their expectations of what they want can change, and we're seeing this a lot in every segment, and quite frankly, as an importing country, we have the same challenge here. And we might want to look at animal care or sustainability. Or price is obviously an attribute that people look at for sure, and other quality measures. So all of these factors become part of the requirements to meet and to target when we export.
You mentioned animal care and changing consumer expectations. You wouldn't happen to be referring or having a certain restaurant chain in mind, would you?
No, I mean this has been these issues have been around for a long time, and we have access to the EU beef market with ractopamine-free and growth hormone-free product, and you just have to go from really commodity area to commodity area, and there's going to be different requirements from country to country. And so this is all part and parcel, again, of the assessment that needs to be done. Where do we have an advantage over our competitors? How are we going to play up that advantage? And in the future, how can we position ourselves so the attributes that we have best able to offer access to our to good soil, clean water, open spaces, good governance practices, high quality. How do we truly leverage that? Because rest assured, our competitors are going to try to get to that consumer overseas equally so. And we need to really leverage those attributes, which we sort of wrap up under the banner of trust. These are the attributes of trust that increasingly the consumer is looking to.
In the big picture, when it comes to trade, we of course have better information or faster communication with customers probably than ever before, but we're also seeing plenty of bilateral deals between countries, whether it's Canada or our competitors. Is trade becoming more complicated than it used to be?
Well, that's a great question. I would prefer to say that the consumer is becoming more complicated. You've got, we were just talking about different attributes of what consumers hold as important. Price remains a big driver for many key markets because once you meet certain quality criteria, price drives those certain markets, such as bulk shipments of some of our commodities. In others, it's the premium market, and China is a great example of this. And how in some of the high-end stores, for example, in Beijing, Shanghai, these are the top end, 70% of their products are imported from countries around the world because they don't trust, that is the Chinese consumer generally that doesn't trust how their food is grown and raised in their country. And so, that's a pretty important market for Canada. But even within China, and I know we're talking here beyond CETA, for example, but and TPP, but even in China, one big country, but there are many, many, many markets within that massive market area. So this speaks to the importance of knowing precisely who you're targeting with what attribute, and then to align that with the capacity to get there. Do we need that agreement? What are those market access promotion vehicles, if you will? What has to be done to meet the standards and the requirements of that particular country? And so it really becomes a very strategic approach to market access and delivery. And so coming back to your question, maybe it is getting a little more complicated. But I think given our quality attributes that we have, perhaps we, over time, as these countries worry about where their food's coming from and how safe and high quality it is, maybe this is the advantage area that we have to really leverage growth.
And that's probably where Canadian companies tend to have the strength too, is the trust and the clean water and some of those aspects. That might be a good place for a company to start if it's looking to get into exporting.
This is an area that deserves to be considered. Today, many of what we export might not be valuing water, in fairness, but water footprints are being placed on labels in supermarkets in Europe, so it is reaching the radar screen there. There's no question that sustainability footprints. Generally, sustainably sourced seafood, for example, is a huge issue. Sustainably sourced palm oil. I know we don't grow palm, but it just gives you an indication of even exports from the developing world, Southeast Asia. This is very much on their minds, and the retailers that source palm oil around the world. So this is not just a trend. This is a fact of life. And as Canada competes for the same premium customers and even the mid and lower end markets, these issues of sustainability, among other things, will be there increasingly. So the ultimate question, and this is really why we seek out trade deals in the right way, is how do we differentiate ourselves in offering and give advantages to get access and deliver on that. So there is a complexity to this, but quite frankly, down the road with Canada's reputation and some of the things we spoke about, we may have a real advantage if we can start leveraging some of these links to these so-called trust attributes.
And this is also where farmers who might be thinking, I don't deal with exporters or export markets directly, why should I care about trade? This is where a move in this direction could impact what happens on farms and how we grow things, how we produce things in Canada.
Yeah, and I think what I think it's becoming increasingly clear that even those who don't feel that they have that direct consumer point of sale connection, such as you mentioned, some of the producers who nevertheless supply into a supply chain that may reach to export markets. What's happening is that retailers, consumers, retailers, and processors who are in those markets want to know where their food comes from, want to know if it's good for them, that is, that it's healthy, safe. For some, they want to know how it's produced. Are our food production practices causing harm to the environment or animals, or even ethical issues around labor safety? And so what's interesting is that these markets are, and essentially with these standards and requirements, are reaching right back and should become increasingly and more directly relevant to the producer. And that way we're seeing these quite a more visible linkage between essentially the soil and the plate, wherever that may be.
The whole traceability idea.
And that brings up, so that's a good point. And so this is where if one says I pledge to source sustainably, the inevitable question is, well, show me, not just tell me, show me. And so we're seeing increasing emphasis on traceability, verification, certification. Metrics become a big part of this. And it's not sufficient to just say I do such and such on my farm or on my orchard or on the pasture. I have to demonstrate the care and responsibility being taken. This is in producers' best interests, but it's also being driven at the other end of the chain.
Ultimately, doesn't it come down to a cost-benefit analysis and whether the producer has the incentive to meet the expectations or the requests, the demands put forward by the export market?
Well, we certainly don't want to be offside our key competitors in the cost or regulatory a burden, if you will. We want to be very careful about what we set up for ourselves or impose. But on the other hand, we have to be very clearly focused on how the markets around the world are changing. And we're seeing this play out perhaps every single day in the newspaper, where there's another initiative announced or around sustainability or food additives or whatever the case may be. And this is what's happening, is that the market's trying to respond to the consumer, and the consumer and their various segments of the consumer marketplace are trying to respond to that fundamental concern about what's in their food and as I've mentioned, and what they're eating. But on the other hand, we got to be very careful to understand what are the costs of meeting and the requirements of meeting these very fast-moving expectations. And I think that only speaks to the importance of the players across supply chains and across the food system of actually working far more collaboratively. Producers, their processors, the distribution, input providers, and among many others. It only speaks to the need to work in a tighter way to deliver on what is truly required to win market share and hopefully grow markets so that there's a win-win across the board.
It's this idea of having a value chain instead of our old traditional commodity market kind of idea. Is that what you're getting at?
Well, these words mean different things to different people. I think that what is clear is that how we produce and supply our food is way more than operating in one's segment. That I just pass on my product to the next person in the chain and hope the consumer likes it. If you really want to think about it, it involves nutritionists and the health community to understand how food is produced. It involves the input sector, whether it's the pesticide, fertilizer, and the science and innovation sector. Financial institutions have a role to facilitate what has to be traded. Processors and retailers. The whole system, depending on what product we're talking about, needs to work better together to take advantage of those markets and the growth here in Canada, and of course, as you started in countries around the world where we're trying to get that access. And if we're able to get a little better aligned and then connect up to government and hopefully line up the right regulatory policy and innovation policy, now we're really working on a strategy to deliver on that market access.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, David. I think there's some good insight in here on the approach we need to take when thinking about the global markets. Of course, so much of what we grow goes to export.
Thanks for your time.
So, needless to say, with how much of what we produce in Canadian agriculture ending up in export markets, it's critical that we understand and stay on top of what's happening in terms of expectations, opportunities, potential threats to export demand, as David also talked about, with more tracking and verification, technology allowing for a major move in that direction. It'll become increasingly important for farms to be on board. Some of the innovative operations already moving and trying things out in that direction. Also some interesting comments from him about how water, Canada's vast freshwater resource, could become a trade advantage. Thanks again to David McInnes and the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, and to you for joining us for another episode of Mind Your Farm Business. Also thanks to RBC for partnering with Real Agriculture on this series. Stay tuned until next time for the next episode in this series on improving your farm management.